this is refuge in awareness, in this wakeful openness. And as with all meditations, just to sense your intention as you begin it. To feel a curiosity without any expectation. To be unwilling to judge yourself. Taking a few full breaths. And I'll be asking questions. And all you need to do is give yourself permission to let whatever arises spontaneously be there. There's zero efforting here. And the first, can you imagine the space between your eyes? And can you imagine the space between your ears? Can you imagine breathing in and out and feeling the space inside the nasal passages? Can you imagine the volume of your tongue? In other words, the space inside the tongue. Can you imagine the space inside the teeth and the gums of the upper palate? Can you imagine the space inside the teeth and gums of the lower palate? Can you imagine the space inside the upper lip? Can you imagine the space inside the lower lip? Can you imagine the space inside the tongue and the gums, teeth and lips simultaneously? So the space inside the whole mouth. Can you imagine the space between the forehead and the nape of the neck? Can you imagine the space under the dome of the skull? Can you imagine the space inside the whole head simultaneously? Can you imagine breathing in and having the throat expand? Breathing out and sensing the space inside the throat and neck area. Can you imagine the space inside the shoulders? Can you imagine the distance between the shoulders? Can you imagine the space filling the shoulders and the upper back? imagine the distance between your shoulders and your elbows? Can you imagine the distance between your elbows and your wrists? Can you imagine the volume of your thumbs? Can you imagine the volume that your index fingers occupy? Can you imagine the space between your thumb and your index fingers? Can you imagine the space inside the middle fingers? Can you imagine the space inside the ring finger? And can you imagine the space inside the small fingers? Can you imagine the space between all the fingers and that suffuses the bones and flesh of the fingers? Can you imagine the space between the palms and the backs of the hands? Can you imagine a space that fills the whole hand? Can you imagine simultaneously the space that fills the hands, the arms, and the shoulders at once? Can you imagine the volume of the heart? Can you imagine breathing in and feeling the lungs expand, and breathing out and feeling the space inside the lungs? Can you imagine the space between the breastbone and the spine? Can you imagine the distance between either side of the chest, sides of the body? Can you imagine the space occupied by the heart, the lungs, and that fills the whole chest simultaneously? Can you imagine the distance between the navel and the back of the spine? Can you imagine the distance between either side of your waist? Can you imagine the distance between the navel and the tailbone, the very base of the spine? Can you imagine breathing in and feeling the whole belly fill with air, expanding, and breathing out and feeling the whole belly filled with space? Can you imagine the distance between the hip joints and the knees? Can you imagine the distance between the knees and the ankles? Can you imagine the volume of the big toes? Can you imagine the space between all the toes, including that which permeates the bones and flesh of the toes? Can you imagine the space between the soles of the feet and the top of the feet? Can you imagine the space filling the feet? Can you imagine the distance between the feet and the core of the earth? Can you imagine breathing in and having the earth, the life energy of the earth, flowing into the body, filling the body, and breathing out and sensing space? Again, breathing in, feeling the earth energy filling you. Breathing out, sensing the space that fills the body. Can you imagine the energy from the front of you extending out infinitely to the stars? Can you imagine the space behind you extending out infinitely to the stars? Can you imagine the space to either side of you extending out infinitely to the stars? Can you imagine the space above you extending out infinitely to the stars? Can you imagine that the space that extends out infinitely and that extends in infinitely is simultaneously, continuously the same space? Again, can you imagine that the space that extends infinitely outward and infinitely inward is continuous? Can you imagine that this space is filled with the light of awareness? Can you imagine, as you rest in that awareness, the expression that forms naturally on your face? Can you imagine how that space of awareness expresses at the heart? Can you imagine at the space of your heart, that luminous vastness there, and the space of every other heart of all beings is continuous. It's one continuous space. Can you imagine moving through your day remembering this heart space, this continuous heart space that we all belong to?